Three cops stopped and insulted an innocent man, not knowing the dashcam recorded everything. It was an ordinary afternoon, the sun was shining, and the streets of the suburban neighborhood were peaceful. The man, just another face in the crowd, had spent a long day at work. His shift had been tiring, but now he was looking forward to getting home and relaxing. His car hummed steadily along the road as he drove, the quiet sound of the engine soothing him. He was lost in thought, thinking about the tasks waiting for him at home, when suddenly a flash of red and blue lights startled him from his daydream. He glanced at the rearview mirror. The lights of a police car blinked urgently behind him. It seemed like a routine traffic stop, nothing unusual, but he couldn't shake off the slight feeling of unease. His hands instinctively gripped the steering wheel tighter as he glanced at the clock on the dashboard. He wasn't speeding, and there was no reason for him to be pulled over. Still, he slowed down and pulled his car to the side of the road just as the officer had instructed. The car came to a gentle stop, and he took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. As he sat there waiting for the officer to approach, he reminded himself to stay calm. He had nothing to hide, nothing to fear. His seatbelt was fastened, his papers were in order, and his car was in good shape. He wasn't a troublemaker, just an everyday person who worked hard for a living. The officer's footsteps grew louder as they approached, the gravel crunching under their boots. The officer knocked on his window, a standard procedure. The man rolled it down slowly, offering a polite smile as he greeted the officer. "Good afternoon, officer. How can I help you?" The officer, a man in his mid-30s, didn't return the smile. Instead, his face was stern as he stared down at the man from outside the car. The man's smile began to fade slightly, but he kept his composure. There was no reason to feel nervous. This was just a simple stop, after all. "I pulled you over because you were speeding," the officer said, his tone flat and matter-of-fact. "Do you know how fast you were going?" The man blinked in surprise. Speeding? He was certain that he hadn't been going over the limit. He glanced around quickly, trying to see the posted speed limit signs, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. "No, officer," he replied. "I don't believe I was speeding. I was driving at the speed limit." The officer narrowed his eyes slightly, almost as if he were suspicious of the man's words. "Well, you were. That's why I stopped you," he said, his voice firm though not unkind. The officer paused for a moment, watching the man closely before adding, "I need to see your license and registration." The man didn't hesitate. He had nothing to hide. He reached into the glove compartment and handed the officer his documents with a polite nod. "Here you go, officer." The officer took the papers, glanced at them briefly, and then looked back at the man. There was something in his eyes, a coldness, that made the man's unease grow a little stronger. He had dealt with police officers before, but this one seemed different. He couldn't quite place why, but something about the way the officer was eyeing him made him feel uncomfortable. The officer turned and walked back to his patrol car with the documents, leaving the man alone in his car. He sat there, his mind racing. Why had he been pulled over? Why had the officer insisted that he was speeding when he knew for a fact he was? He checked the clock again. Only a few minutes had passed, but it felt like an eternity. The minutes dragged on as he stared out the window. His thoughts were interrupted by the officer's return. The officer didn't speak immediately. He just stood outside the car, his hands resting on the roof of the vehicle, watching the man intently. The silence hung between them for a moment before the officer finally spoke again. "Do you know why I'm really stopping you today?" the officer asked, his voice now colder, more serious. The man blinked in confusion. "No, officer, I honestly don't. You said I was speeding, but I don't believe I was." The officer's eyes narrowed again, and he leaned in slightly, his face close to the man's window. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," he said, his voice now demanding. The man's heart skipped a beat. What was going on? Why did the officer suddenly want him to step out of the car? He hadn't done anything wrong. "I'm sorry, officer, but is there a reason why I need to step out?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer's tone hardened. "Just step out of the vehicle." There was no arguing. The man slowly opened the door, feeling the weight of the officer's gaze on him. As he stepped out of the car, he felt the tension in the air grow even heavier. Something wasn't right. He had no idea what was happening, but he had a feeling that things were about to escalate. As he stood on the side of the road, the officer motioned for him to stand still, then turned to speak to his partner. The second officer, a woman, walked over from the other side of the car and stood beside her colleague. The two officers exchanged a few words, their voices low but clearly not meant for the man to hear. The first officer glanced back at him, his expression unreadable. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his tone now taking on a more accusatory edge. The man shook his head, confused by the question. "No, I'm not. I'm just passing through. I live a few towns over." The officer seemed to consider this for a moment before responding. "Well, you don't belong here, do you?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. The man frowned, wondering where this line of questioning was going. "I'm just driving home," he said, trying to keep things calm. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he exchanged another look with his partner. The second officer, who had been quiet up until now, stepped forward, her gaze colder than before. "We've got to make sure everything checks out," she said, her voice firm. The man's confusion deepened. What did she mean by that? Was there something about his appearance, his car, or his route that had caught their attention? He had no idea, but the tension in the air was palpable. He had no choice but to stand there, waiting, as the officers continued to speak in low, conspiratorial tones. Minutes passed, and the man felt like a target, though he wasn't sure why. The officers were acting like he was guilty of something, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. His mind raced with questions. What was happening? Why were they treating him like this? He couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for something, perhaps some kind of excuse to make the situation more difficult. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officers seemed to reach some sort of decision. The first officer turned to the man and spoke again, his tone still cold but slightly more formal this time. "We're going to have to take a look inside your car," he said. The man's heart raced. They couldn't just search his car without a reason. He had every right to refuse, but at that moment he wasn't sure what would happen if he did. Would they escalate things further? Would they try to force him out of his car, or worse? The dashcam mounted on his rearview mirror caught every moment. The officers didn't know it, but the camera was recording everything. The officer's words hit him like a cold splash of water, but the man still didn't quite understand what was happening. He had been pulled over for speeding, but now they were suggesting that something more was going on. The request to search his car only deepened his confusion. He had no idea what they were looking for or why they were so determined to investigate every detail of his life. Everything about this stop felt wrong, but the man was uncertain how to respond. As the second officer moved toward his car, the man stood there, frozen in place. The words, "We're going to have to take a look inside your car," echoed in his mind. Was this how it was supposed to go? He had seen traffic stops before, and they had always seemed much more straightforward. But this was different. The officers had treated him like a suspect, and the coldness in their voices made him uneasy. They had given no explanation, no real reason for their actions, and they had barely listened to anything he had said. He watched as the second officer moved around the car, inspecting it with a sharp eye. Her partner, who had been standing by the side, watched her closely, keeping an eye on the man as though waiting for him to do something suspicious. But there was nothing for him to do. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just an ordinary person, caught in the middle of what felt like a misunderstanding. The man couldn't help but feel a sense of growing dread. Every passing second seemed to stretch on longer than the last. He wasn't just dealing with a simple traffic stop. He was caught in a situation that he couldn't explain, and he had no idea how it would end. What if they found something they didn't like? What if they tried to accuse him of something he hadn't done? He felt a tightness in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had to keep his composure. The more he stayed calm, the more likely they were to realize their mistake. The officer's hands moved over the surface of the car, feeling the metal of the doors and the frame as though searching for something hidden. The man stood there, his legs beginning to feel stiff from the tension. His mind was racing. Should he speak up again? Should he ask for a lawyer, or was it too soon? He didn't even know if he had the right to ask for one. All he wanted was for this to end, for the officers to simply let him go so he could continue on his way. But the seconds dragged on, and the search seemed to be getting more thorough. The second officer opened the trunk and began rummaging through it, pulling out bags and inspecting every corner. The first officer, still standing by the man's side, didn't say a word. His gaze never wavered, never softened. There was no sign of empathy or understanding, just a cold, professional demeanor that made the man feel as though he were on trial for something. As the second officer inspected the car's interior, the man caught a glimpse of the dashcam mounted on his rearview mirror. He remembered in that moment that everything was being recorded. The camera had caught everything so far, the officer's harsh words, their cold behavior, the tension in the air. He wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. On one hand, it was comforting to know that there was evidence of what was happening, but on the other hand, the thought of what might come next was too overwhelming to process. The man's hands began to sweat as he shifted on his feet. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to escalate things further by being confrontational. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being unfairly treated. His car had nothing to hide. There was no reason for him to be standing there, waiting for the officers to find something that wasn't there. Still, he stayed quiet, watching the search continue. Minutes passed, and the second officer finally finished inspecting the car. She stood up, dusting off her hands, and walked back toward the first officer. They exchanged a few words, too quiet for the man to hear, and then turned their attention back to him. The tension in the air was palpable, and the man felt a chill run down his spine. The first officer spoke again, his voice still firm but with a touch of impatience. "We've checked everything. There's nothing unusual here," he said, as though the man should be relieved. "But we'll need to run your information through the system just to be sure." The man's stomach dropped. Run his information through the system? Was that really necessary? He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't even been speeding. But now it seemed like they were treating him like he was some kind of criminal, like there was something they were looking for in his past. He nodded slowly, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Of course," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was still trying to understand what was happening. What kind of system were they running his information through? And why had they decided to target him in the first place? The officer handed him back his documents, his fingers brushing against the man's hand briefly. The touch felt cold, distant. "You're free to go for now," the officer said, his tone as impersonal as ever. "But don't think this is over. We'll be watching you." The man's breath caught in his throat. Watching him? What did that even mean? His mind was spinning as he processed the officer's words. He had done nothing wrong. He had followed the rules, been polite and cooperative. And yet they were treating him as if he were guilty of something. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The officers had already begun to walk back to their patrol car, their conversation turning to something else, something mundane. But the man couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep within him. He wasn't sure if he had been let go because they realized their mistake, or if it was just another part of their investigation. He glanced over at his car one last time before climbing back in. The dashcam's light blinked steadily, recording everything. He felt a small sense of relief knowing that there was a record of the encounter. No one could deny what had happened today. His dashcam had captured it all. As he pulled away from the side of the road, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The officers were still standing by their patrol car, watching him as he drove off. He didn't know what had just happened, but he couldn't help but feel that this wouldn't be the last time he had to deal with them. With his heart still racing, he continued driving, hoping that whatever had just happened would be behind him soon. But he also knew that something had changed. The unease he felt would stay with him for a long time, and no matter how hard he tried to shake it off, the feeling of being targeted, of being watched, would linger. The drive away from the scene felt surreal. The man's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, but his fingers were cold. His mind replayed the entire traffic stop over and over. What had just happened? Why had the officers treated him like that? He hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't speeding, and his car was clean. Still, they had treated him like a criminal, and that nagging feeling of unease hadn't left him. The dashboard clock seemed to tick louder now, the minutes dragging as he drove. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but every passing car seemed to make him more paranoid. Were they still watching him? Was there something about his car, his appearance, or his route that had triggered the officer's suspicion? He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary traffic stop. It had felt like something more. As he drove, the uncertainty swirled in his mind. He had never been through something like that before. Sure, he had seen police officers pull people over on the side of the road. It had always seemed routine, quick, and simple. But this time, it had felt different. The officers had been harsh and distant. their treatment of him growing more suspicious with every word. And the fact that they had gone through his car without finding anything felt like it didn't matter. They had already decided he was guilty of something. His thoughts were interrupted when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it quickly, noticing a message from his friend. He hesitated for a moment before unlocking his phone to read it. His friend had been asking if he wanted to grab dinner, but all the man could think about was the traffic stop. He wasn't in the mood for socializing. He wasn't in the mood for anything, really. He felt on edge, unsure of what to do with the emotions running through him. He quickly typed a response, letting his friend know that he wasn't feeling up to it. He needed some time to think. He needed to process what had happened. As soon as he hit send, his mind began to race again. What had the officers been looking for? They hadn't given him any real explanation. They hadn't even apologized for the way they treated him. It was as if they had already decided that he was someone to be watched, someone to be questioned, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on here. What was it about him that had drawn their attention? Was it the car, his clothes, his age, the area he was in? He had no answers, just an overwhelming sense of confusion. But something kept nagging at him. He needed to find out what had caused this. He needed to understand why he had been treated this way. The man's eyes drifted to the rearview mirror again, though he knew there was no one following him. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted. He couldn't help but wonder if the officers had let him go just to follow him from a distance, to see if he would do something that would justify their treatment of him. It felt like a strange kind of game, and he didn't know the rules. They had put him in a position where he felt like he had to prove he was innocent, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. His grip on the steering wheel tightened again as he turned down a quieter street. The dim streetlights flickered overhead as he passed, casting long shadows across the pavement. It was strange. He used to love these quiet streets, the peacefulness that came with driving through neighborhoods he didn't know. But tonight, everything felt different. Everything felt suspicious. Every car that passed, every person walking along the sidewalk seemed to be watching him. He felt exposed, like the weight of the world was on his shoulders, and it was getting heavier by the second. He pulled into a nearby parking lot, feeling the need to stop and clear his mind. He parked his car in an empty space and sat there for a moment, the engine still running. The car idled quietly, but the man's thoughts were anything but still. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to calm himself. But his mind wouldn't stop racing. The events of the afternoon had left him unsettled, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The more he thought about the traffic stop, the more he realized how strange it had been. The officers had acted as though they were looking for something specific, even though they had no reason to suspect him. He hadn't done anything wrong. But still, they had insisted on searching his car, on running his information through the system as though he were a criminal. It didn't make sense. Why had they done that? Why hadn't they just let him go after confirming that there was nothing wrong? His thoughts were interrupted again by a sharp beep from his phone. He glanced at the screen and saw that his friend had responded, asking if everything was okay. The man stared at the message for a moment, unsure of how to reply. He wasn't sure if he could explain what had happened. How could he explain the fear, the uncertainty, the feeling of being targeted when he hadn't done anything wrong? How could he put into words the sense of violation he felt, even though no physical harm had been done to him? He typed a quick response, telling his friend that he was fine, just a little shaken up. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The truth was, he didn't know what was going on, and that terrified him. He didn't know if he could trust the system anymore. He didn't know if he could trust the people who were supposed to protect him. For the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. He let out a long sigh, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. His breathing slowed, but the tightness in his chest didn't go away. He had to do something. He had to find out what was happening. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. This was about something bigger, something that he couldn't ignore. He couldn't let it go, not without answers. He needed to find out why he had been treated like a criminal. The man made a decision. He wasn't going to let this go. He was going to figure out what had happened, no matter what it took. He reached for his phone again, his fingers shaking slightly as he dialed the number for the police department. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he had to start somewhere. He needed to ask questions to get answers. He couldn't just let the officers walk away without explaining themselves. As the phone rang, he took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He didn't know how this conversation would go, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let them make him feel small. Not this time. The phone call was brief. The man spoke to someone at the police department who seemed uninterested in providing him with any clear answers. The conversation left him feeling more frustrated than when he had started. He had expected to find some comfort in reaching out, to have someone acknowledge what had happened, but instead, he was left with more questions. He ended the call and sat back in his car, staring blankly at the dashboard. His mind continued to race. The officers had let him go without any apology or explanation. They hadn't even given him a chance to voice his concerns. It had all felt so impersonal, as if they didn't care about his side of the story. That feeling of being treated as an outsider, as someone undeserving of their respect, weighed heavily on him. The man looked at the dashcam mounted on the rearview mirror. It had quietly recorded everything: the harsh treatment, the words exchanged, the tense silence. The footage was undeniable, but would it be enough to get his point across? He had the evidence, but now he needed to know what to do with it. He could share it with others, but would anyone listen? Or would the officers simply deny everything, dismissing his claims as a misunderstanding? He didn't know, but he couldn't let this go. Not after everything he had gone through. The silence of the car seemed to press down on him. He wasn't sure if it was the uncertainty of the situation or if it was the quiet of the parking lot surrounding him, but everything felt suffocating. The air in the car felt thick, as if he was trapped in a small space with no way out. He wanted to breathe freely again, to stop thinking about the stop and the way it had made him feel, but the thought of leaving it unresolved gnawed at him. He glanced at his phone again. The screen was still open to his friend's last message. He hadn't replied yet. His friend had asked if everything was okay, but how could he explain what had happened? How could he explain the way he had been treated without sounding paranoid or like he was making things up? He didn't want to seem like someone who exaggerated, someone who made mountains out of molehills. But this wasn't just a small inconvenience. This had been a moment that had shaken him to his core. He typed a short response to his friend. "I'm okay, just trying to process everything, not sure what happened back there." It was the truth, but it didn't feel like enough. He didn't want to share too much just yet, especially since he wasn't sure what to make of it all himself. He wanted to find clarity, but that wasn't something he could get by talking about it with someone who hadn't been there. No, this was something he had to figure out on his own. The car idled quietly, the engine humming softly as he sat in the parking lot. He wasn't sure what to do next. Part of him wanted to call someone else, maybe a lawyer, someone who could advise him on his rights, on how to handle the situation. But another part of him wanted to forget the whole thing, to move on and pretend it never happened. He couldn't do that, though. Something inside him wouldn't let him. He wasn't the kind of person who could just walk away from injustice, especially when it had been directed at him. He had to make sure the truth came out, even if he didn't know exactly how to go about it. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. He could get the footage from the dashcam. He could show it to others. He could reach out to the right people and make sure that the officers' actions didn't go unchecked. He wasn't alone in this. He had the evidence, and he had the right to stand up for himself. But it wasn't just about the footage anymore. It wasn't just about getting back at the officers. It was about ensuring that this kind of treatment didn't happen again. The man wasn't naive enough to believe that the situation would change overnight. But if he could help prevent others from going through the same thing, it would make all of this worth it. He finally decided to take action. He needed to be sure that the footage would be seen by the right people. He didn't want to just keep it to himself, tucked away on his phone. It needed to be shared with others, his friends, the public, anyone who could help bring attention to the issue. He opened his phone again and began searching for local organizations that could offer advice. He wasn't sure who to reach out to, but he knew there had to be someone who could guide him through the next steps. He wasn't going to let the officers' behavior slide without a response. If they thought they could get away with treating people like that, they were wrong. As he browsed through the search results, he came across the contact information for a civil rights organization. He hesitated for a moment but then clicked the number. He needed guidance, and they were the right people to ask. When the phone rang, it felt like a lifeline. It rang twice before someone answered. A calm, kind voice greeted him, and he quickly explained his situation. The person on the other end listened attentively, asking him to describe what had happened in as much detail as he could provide. As he spoke, the man could feel a weight lifting off his shoulders. Someone was listening. Someone was taking him seriously. The person on the phone explained his options, advising him on how to proceed. They suggested filing a formal complaint with the police department, as well as seeking legal advice to ensure his rights were protected. They also recommended sharing the footage with a few trusted local journalists who could help get the story out to a broader audience. After the call ended, the man felt a little more confident. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew he wasn't alone in this. He had a plan, and he knew that by taking action, he could begin to take back control. The officers might have tried to intimidate him, but he wasn't going to back down. He had a right to be treated with respect, and he wasn't going to let their actions go unnoticed. He sat for a few moments longer in the car, taking a deep breath. The night air felt different now, still a little heavy but less suffocating. He had a clear path forward, and that was enough to make him feel like he could breathe again. It wasn't going to be easy, but he knew he was doing the right thing. With a final glance at the parking lot around him, the man started the car and drove off. He didn't know how long the process would take or what the outcome would be, but for the first time since the traffic stop, he felt like he was finally on the path to justice. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the principle that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity, no matter who they were or where they came from. And that made all the difference. The man drove away from the parking lot, the weight of everything that had happened still hanging heavily on his shoulders. It felt like he was carrying a burden that he couldn't shake off. But for the first time since the traffic stop, he felt like he had a sense of direction. He had a plan now. He had made the call to the civil rights organization, and he knew what steps he needed to take next. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready to see this through. As he made his way home, the familiar route no longer felt as comforting as it usually did. His mind kept returning to the moments from earlier that day, the way the officers had treated him, the way they had acted as though he were guilty of something. He couldn't stop replaying the scene over and over, wondering what he could have done differently, if anything at all. But he knew that asking himself those questions wouldn't get him anywhere. What mattered now was how he moved forward. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the car's engine quieted, but the thoughts in his head continued to swirl. He sat in the car for a moment, staring at his house. The evening air was cool, but it felt like a heavy weight still pressed against his chest. He had never felt so uncertain, so unsure of what would happen next. But there was a part of him that knew he had done the right thing by reaching out for help. He wasn't going to let this incident fade into the background. It had shaken him, but it also gave him a fire he hadn't known he needed. He grabbed his phone and checked the messages he'd received. His friend had replied again, asking if he was sure everything was okay. The man smiled softly to himself, realizing how much his friend cared, even if he hadn't fully understood the gravity of the situation. He typed a quick message back. "I'm fine, just needed to talk to some people about what happened. I'm doing what I can." He put the phone down and took a deep breath, steeling himself. It was time to move forward, time to focus on what he could control. The next steps would be crucial. He still had the dashcam footage, and he knew that it could make a difference. But he also understood that it wasn't just about having evidence. It was about ensuring that the right people saw it and took it seriously. The following morning, he sat down at his desk and began the process of gathering everything he needed. He contacted the lawyer that the civil rights organization had recommended, and after a brief consultation, they agreed to take on his case. The lawyer was kind and understanding, listening to the details of the incident with care. After discussing the best course of action, they assured him that they would handle things from a legal standpoint. It was a relief to know that he wasn't alone in this fight. Next, the man reached out to the local news outlets. He knew that the footage had the potential to make waves, and if the story got enough attention, it might prompt the authorities to take action. He sent emails to reporters, explaining what had happened and attaching the dashcam video. He didn't expect them to act immediately, but he hoped that his story would be heard. Days passed, and during that time the man felt a growing sense of purpose. The fear that had clouded his thoughts earlier began to fade. He had taken control. He had stood up for himself, and he wasn't going to let anyone make him feel small or insignificant. No matter how intimidating the officers had been, he was doing what he could to make sure they were held accountable. It wasn't long before he received a response from one of the local news stations. They wanted to interview him, to hear his side of the story. The man was both nervous and excited. He hadn't anticipated this level of attention, but it felt like a sign that things were moving in the right direction. He agreed to the interview, and a reporter came to his home a few days later to hear everything he had to say. The interview was calm and straightforward. He spoke openly about the traffic stop, explaining how he had been treated unfairly and how he had felt during the encounter. He described the officer's behavior, and he shared how the dashcam had recorded everything. The reporter listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and giving him the space to share his experience. It felt good to have someone listen, to have his voice heard. After the interview, the man felt a sense of relief. It was out there now. The story was getting attention, and he had done everything he could to make sure it was shared. He still didn't know how it would all play out, but he was no longer afraid. He had stood up for himself, and he had taken the steps necessary to ensure that the truth came to light. A few days later, the news station aired the segment, and it quickly gained traction. People began to comment, share, and talk about what had happened. Many expressed their disbelief at how the officers had treated the man, and others shared their own stories of similar encounters. The support from the community was overwhelming. It felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. For the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of pride. He had done the right thing, and now the story was reaching people who could help bring about change. The police department was forced to respond. They issued a statement acknowledging the incident, and an internal investigation was launched. The officers involved were put on administrative leave while the department reviewed the footage and the details of the stop. The man wasn't sure what would come from the investigation, but he knew that the officers' actions had been called into question. That was a start. The process wasn't over. It wasn't an instant fix, and it wasn't easy, but the man had started something important. By speaking out, by sharing his story, he had made sure that the officers involved could no longer hide behind their badges without consequence. He knew that this wouldn't be the last time he had to fight for justice, but he also knew that he had made a difference. His story had reached people, and it had started a conversation about accountability and respect. As the days went on, the man felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had done what he could to make sure the truth was heard, and now he could move forward. The road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, but he was ready for whatever came next. He had proven to himself that he was capable of standing up for what was right, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be. The experience had changed him. It had opened his eyes to the importance of speaking up, of not letting injustice slide by unnoticed. And he knew that, no matter where life took him, he would always carry with him the lesson that standing up for yourself, and for others, was the only way to ensure a better future.